welcome to History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I'm honored to be joined by authors Robert Dugoni, Jeff Langholz, and Chris Crabtree, authors of Hold Strong. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Great to be here.
Well, let's start a little with the history. I want to start there because I've read dozens, countless World War II books. I've taught social studies in school. I went through history in college. I have never heard of the Arisan Maru or the Japanese hellship. So tell us a little bit about what it is and maybe why it's a lesser known part of World War II history.
I'll take a stab at that one. You know, Colin, I was in the same boat. I watched all the World War II movies by Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg, and before that, John Wayne, read all the books, majored in history in college, even took an entire course called World War II, and nowhere was there a chapter on these prisoner transport ships in the Pacific called Japanese hellships. Where has this been? So we decided it would make good sense to share that undertold chapter of history. And we came across a story, in particular, the Arisan Maru, that seemed especially compelling to tell.
And go into a little bit more detail. What is this ship? What happened to it? Why did you decide to write a novel about it?
I think Chris can tell you the origin story, how this whole crazy 11-and-a-half-year project began.
One of our characters, Colin, in the story is named Father Thomas Cecina, and I went to a high school named after this particular character, Father Tom. So I went to Cecina Memorial High School in Indianapolis, Indiana, on the east side. And when I was researching another story that I was looking at, or that I was writing, that had a Catholic priest in it, I started finding out things about Father Tom, and this is where this is the original origin story. Strangely enough, as there was not a time in my life where I did not know this man's name. Not one moment. I knew I had three older brothers. I knew what grade school I was going to go to. I knew what high school I was going to go, 4 years at. But the interesting part is, with this particular individual, and when I found the story and I brought it up to my friend Jeff, he was in shock, as I was, that this was something that nobody had heard about. And we also found out that Father Tom was basically a person that was very close to all of the major events in the Pacific Theater. And so he became a focal point of the research that we did and the timeline and the settings.
Chris mentioned I was shocked. Chris and I were sitting at a bar in Costa Rica, and I'm visiting him down there. He tells me this story about the Arisan Maru and Father Tom, and I about spit up my beer. And I'm like, bartender, another round. We're gonna be here a while. And Chris tells me this incredible story, and I'm like, the world needs to know this story, Chris. More people should hear this. And that's how it started.
And how then did Robert get involved in the project?
Well, I'll tee it up and then hand it off to Bob. But Chris and I decided to try to share this story, and we don't know much about writing novels, and so we're making it up as we go. We're trying to piece together the story. There are clues around the world: Philippines, a remote village in China, National Archives buried amidst thousands of declassified documents, buried in a submarine a mile below the surface in the South China Sea. Trying to piece together the story with all the clues, but also write a novel. And that's something we're rookies at. And so we did that for several years. And then we kind of hit a wall. We're like, this is about as good as we can get it at this point, but it's not good enough. The quality of the storytelling needs to be on par with the quality of the underlying true story. And for that, it made sense to work with an established author, somebody who's a master of the craft, somebody who's been doing this for decades. And so we were very fortunate to connect with Bob Dugoni to come in and do that. He does this a lot, and if you've read some of his, I don't know, he's famous especially for characterization. I don't know if you ever heard of a book called The Extraordinary Life of Sam Howell, but Bob's especially good with characters, developing characters that readers really, really fall in love with. And so we worked with Bob. Chris and we've run several laps around the track. We're getting tired. And we're thinking we can make it to the finish line, but it'll probably be on our knees and it might take another 3 or 4 years. So we handed the baton off to Bob and he ran with it. And boy, did he run with it.
Well, Jeff is very kind, and I'm grateful for that. But you know, this isn't something that I do often. The only other book I ever co-authored was the first book I ever wrote called The Cyanide Canary. But I have to tell you, when I read the first 50 pages of the manuscript, like all of us have been discussing, I was really just blown away that there were so many layers to this story. They had done a fantastic job creating Sam Carlson and Sarah Haber and telling this story of these two young people from a small town in Minnesota who get separated by war, and then what they go through. But I think the thing that was most impressive to me, I think the thing that is going to really blow readers away, is the amount of research that these two guys did is, you know, beyond great. It's almost incomprehensible. I mean, we say that the book is inspired by true events because we've created characters to live in the time period, but the time period itself is very real. And what they were able to capture was, they were able to capture what was happening at that time, coming out of a depression, entering into a war, how it just really changed people's lives forever, much like the assassination of John Kennedy. You know, everybody's life just changed after that moment, and you couldn't go back to the way things were, not in America, not in the world. And I was literally, I was blown away by the amount of work that these two had done on this, and I felt for myself, I felt that this was a story that people needed to read. It's a story that people needed to be told, and I really was rooting for both of them. And so, you know, when they came to me and said, "Would you help us get it over the finish line?" I was nervous, to be honest, because I wanted to do the story justice. I wanted to do their research justice. I wanted to include their voice in what they had done, the characters and everything. So it was a very difficult process. In some respects, it was a lot more difficult than just writing a novel on my own. But I was also elated because, as I said, I felt like this is such a strong story, and they had handed me such a strong story to then sort of mold and do what I do well, which is bring characters to life. And boy, it ended up being, it was a fantastic process. I don't know that I would do it again, but doing it with these two individuals was really terrific. They're pros, both of them.
Well, I have a lot of follow-up questions. I don't know if we can even cover all of them in the time we have, but I guess I'd like to know a little bit more. Jeff had mentioned this was an 11-year process. Bob, you had mentioned how much research went into it, which is clear when you pick up the book and look at the bibliography and the afterword and the notes. So I think it definitely appeals to multiple different readers. Me, for instance, as a reader, I'm really interested in that real history. I'm going to be looking at those notes. But then we have readers who want character-driven stories, and we have Sam and Sarah here. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about combining your strengths here, the research and the characterization, and how that all came together, and how it was such a huge project.
I think Jeff and Chris can handle that question, can answer that question. Yeah. But I'll say this, what you're getting in the book is only a small portion of the amount of research that they did, you know, because you can't print everything. The book would be like a telephone book. So what you're getting is a small portion of a tremendous amount of research.
Mm. I'll I'll hop in and then pass it off to these guys. Maybe Chris can talk in particular about the Father Tom character, and Bob can talk about Sarah, who we really deepened and broadened that character. But in terms of the research, we've all read these stories or watched these movies where they say it's inspired by real events or based on a true story. And authors like to say that a lot, in part because it helps sell books or fill movie seats. But I've often wondered just how true is it? How closely did you follow it? Is it, 1% or 90% or what? And in this case, we wanted to remove all doubt. We wanted people to look at the endnotes chapter by chapter by chapter and track the true underlying story with all the sources documented if they wanted to, and they could see for themselves. Part of that reason, part of the motivation for tracking the true story with 476 or 86 notes was because there are some pretty incredible, miraculous things that happen here, things that are hard to believe. And so that made it especially important when these miraculous things occur to have the documentation that shows they really happened. And then tying that with creative writing and storytelling, that's where, Chris, maybe you could talk more about the Thomas Cecina character and his themes and so on, and then Bob, the Sarah character, especially.
Well, Colin, our original line in our original storyline when we were molding this story was it started with a mistake, and the mistake was in me. I spent 4 years at that school, and it's been years since I left it. I did not know who Father Tom really was. I knew him to be a legitimate quote unquote World War II war hero, but I didn't know what he did. And it's just so remarkable that in one piece of evidence that we got from the Archdiocese of Indianapolis was a letter written by Father Tom's superior officer, John Duffy, Father John Duffy, and this was post-war, and he wrote it from a hospital bed in Bombay, India, at the end of the war when he was recovering, and he was writing it to Archbishop Ritter in Indianapolis, saying, "I think that you lost one of your priests," and was giving credit to what this guy had accomplished in the time that he was stationed there in the Philippines. He was always a guy that ran toward the danger, and Father Duffy was bayoneted during the Bataan Death March, bayoneted twice and left for dead. And Father Tom stopped at risk of his own life and gave him last rites on the road. And he ultimately was snatched off the road by some Filipino guerrillas and survived the war, and even fought with the guerrillas for a while. But this was the kind of guy that he was, and we're hoping that it comes through. And the original impetus of this story for me wasn't to talk about hellships. It was to talk about this amazing army chaplain who had survived all the way the invasion of the Philippines, the Bataan Death March, a couple of years and 2.5 years in prisoner of war camps, and then ultimately a hellship that he didn't even have to get on, but got on because of the men. He got on for them, and so we felt very that it was very important to tell his story.
And what they handed off to me was really a gold nugget, a diamond, if you will, in the rough that I just had the pleasure of polishing. I really saw this story as the movies that my father and I used to watch together when I was a young man. My dad loved old movies, and so all of a sudden I'm immersed in this story where this young man in Minnesota is running a movie projector at the Paradise Theater, and they're watching Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers dancing on ships, and because that's how people escaped. And I saw that movie in my head, and that's the movie that I wanted to tell. I wanted to tell that movie that gets interrupted by this horrible time in our nation's history. But I wanted to come back to that movie, and I don't want to spoil anything, but that's what I wanted. I wanted the Hollywood ending. I wanted the movie that it represented. Those movies represented what people wanted America to be before the Depression, before the World War, before the Vietnam War, before Kennedy's assassination. It was this bucolic existence in this great country, this great land, and all of it was interrupted. All of it was sort of destroyed, if you will, and that's what I wanted. But I wanted that Hollywood ending, that movie could still go on, if you could find it in your heart.
I'm curious to know more about the actual tragic history behind all this. As I read in the afterword, these Japanese transport ships had been targeted intentionally, even though the United States government often knew they had American POWs. Can you talk about learning that fact and more about why, how was it justified, and how do you handle it in your story?
I'll start and then Bob and Chris can chime in as well. But it is it's a complex topic. The idea that our code breakers had broken the Japanese code and our radio spies were eavesdropping on all the radio traffic. And we knew where their ships were at any given moment. Every day, all the Japanese ships sailing around the Pacific were required to radio to their headquarters in Tokyo what their noontime position would be, and including what they're carrying, what port they left, their port destination, and so on. So our radio spies in Hawaii and Washington, D.C. were eavesdropping on all this. And so when more than 100 of these ships were carrying POWs, Allied POWs around the Pacific, there's a pretty good chance we knew that those POWs were in the holds of those ships. Yet if we had a convoy, our submarines were to sink a convoy of, let's say, 15 ships, and they only leave the one ship that has the Allied POWs in it, there's a risk the Japanese could smell a rat. They could sense that we'd broken their code and change the code within days. And if they did that, it might take us another year to break the code. And the war would go on, and tens of thousands of more people would die, maybe hundreds thousands more. And so the US made a strategic decision to protect the safest secret, the most important secret, right up there only with the atomic bomb program. This secret that had to be kept at all costs, and at great human cost, though. About 40% casualty rate of our Allied POWs who are on these ships.
Let's talk. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the research here. Bob, obviously, you've mentioned some of the great work that Jeff and Chris have done here, but you guys are following in a line of being assisted by other historians and institutions. I was particularly impressed with the Baton Project. So tell me about some of the places you went to for your research, and if anyone else is interested in diving into this topic more, where should they go?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the Baton Project. That's a great resource online for anybody who wants to know more about people. We had a situation recently where Bob, a friend of Bob's, needed to learn about 1, 2, and then 3 POWs who were on one of these Japanese transport ships, and the batonproject.org is a great resource. You can find out about those people. Yeah, so the resources were all over the place, scattered around the world. There are clues in the Philippines and a small town in China, and especially at the National Archives, where they've got the decoded intercepts, What our radio spies, when they were eavesdropping, the code breakers would write it down on a 3x5 index card. Okay, this ship left here, and here's what it's carrying, and so on. They have these 3x5 index cards. A lot of those are now declassified, and we could sift through those. Same thing with the guerrillas who were fighting in the Philippines. They were on radio contact with General MacArthur in Australia. And so we found I don't know, a smoking gun, if you will, at the MacArthur Memorial in Virginia. One of the guerrilla units had sent a telegram to MacArthur's headquarters in Australia saying, hey, there's a ship in Manila. It's got about 2,000 POWs in it, and it just left here on October 11th, 1944, sent by the guerrillas to our headquarters. So we had to piece this together from a lot of different sources. But again, from history, since you've studied history so much and written about history as fiction, that's just part of it, is having the timeline of real events and piecing together the real story. The real creative part is what Chris and Bob do here with the creative writing, especially, and tie that to wonderful, unforgettable characters and plots that builds to a climax and so on.
Jeff, mention your website, because people can go to your website to get more information.
All right, sure. At my author website, which has been live for a grand total of like 72 hours, jefflangholz.com. You can download a list of all 1,800 POWs who are on this ship. You can download a list of the 87 submariners who are involved with this story, and you can get some photos, including, declassified Chinese radio messages that are code breakers intercepted in Hawaii. You can look at what the Army put together when they did a war crimes investigation after the war, the documents, like, okay, which hold were these guys in on the ship and so on. And they've got diagrams for possible criminal prosecution. We've got those pictures of those from the National Archives and various other things.
From what I can understand, you guys live in various parts of the world. I imagine you had to do some travel, that you weren't just sitting at your desks the whole time. I did read, I think, in your afterward that you went onto an actual submarine. Can you talk about some of the legwork you did throughout the process of writing this novel?
Yeah, I'll chime in again. Yeah, just getting inside a real World War II Baleo class submarine, the USS Pomponido, to understand the layout and where the forward torpedo tubes are and the conning tower and so on. Just understanding that was really helpful. And then just interviewing various people, and then especially the real gold mine was at the National Archives 2 facility in College Park. You go deep in there. There are thousands and thousands of boxes of declassified documents, and you sift through those things and try to find the needle in the haystack. And I think we did.
And are there still materials that remain classified that you can get your hands on?
Yeah, there are supposedly still materials that are classified that we don't have yet, and I'm curious. I'll be the first to look at those. For example, there are probably some involving I won't go, I don't want to do a spoiler here, but I'm really interested to see some declassified that have to do with the fate of a submarine that's in here and whether or not this submarine surfaced to attempt to rescue some Allied POWs who are floating in the water. 2 senior admirals who are in charge of our submarine and fleet in the Pacific, they both wrote books after the war. And they said, maybe the submarine surfaced after it sunk the ship and tried to rescue some POWs, maybe. And I think they might have known something that they couldn't say at the time. They didn't want to tip their hand to the Japanese or anybody else that we had broken their code. So I can't wait for those to be declassified.
I'd like to ask just a little bit more about the process of the three of you working together. Can anyone can take this question on. What were some of, well, first of all, the advantages? Obviously, each of you have different expertise and are able to contribute something different, but what were also some of the challenges, maybe some of the bumps in the road? Or did you ever have any disagreements? How did you handle things like that?
I'm happy to say that this is not a template to write a book. The way that we went about it, Jeff and I, we like to joke quite a bit during this process when we would get hung up with our day jobs. So it would just be I've got some day job issues I have to deal with. I'm a middle and high school English language arts teacher, literature teacher, and Jeff also teaches at university. And so we passed our writing back and forth over the internet. It was very seldom that we were ever not in the same room. We weren't in the same nation for the vast majority of the time of the writing. The ease of working. Jeff and I are longtime friends. We were Peace Corps volunteers back in the 80s. And so we've known each other for a good long time and trust each other. And so it was a pleasure to work with him and to reignite a friendship that from those days. So the challenges, yeah, there was always disagreement, of course, and but when you're working with a professional like Jeff and a person of his quality, it was a pleasure to hash out some of the most difficult parts and to even discuss the weight of the story. I mean, we always felt the weight of the underlying story was our constant light. It was the weight of this story. It has to get out. It has to get out well, and more people need to hear about these events.
I'll just chime in there. Maybe we can hear from Bob, but Chris and I like to joke that today's modern technology, there are all these collaboration tools you can use now to facilitate collaboration, and we use absolutely none of them. We just work out the document, send it back to him. He'd work on it, send it back to me. But then, speaking of sending it back and forth, once Bob joined the team, Chris and I were like, "Here's the baton, Bob. Take it and run, and we're just gonna go sit down and have a beer over here and catch our breath." And Bob took the baton and ran. He ran through a rigorous developmental. First of all, he reworked the manuscript, fixed the plot, made the narrative flow better, fewer flashbacks, more momentum built into the climax. The characterization, he deepened it, especially Sarah's character. Father Tom, more leadership. Our antagonist, this Japanese guy, more complexity, the characterization, and then the voice, the writing as well. I mean, it's just crisper, more authentic dialogue, and so on. So Chris and I handed the baton off to Bob. He not only worked his magic, but then our publisher requires a rigorous developmental editing round. And so Bob led the charge through a really detailed developmental edit, and then not one, but 2 copy edit rounds and various other things. So we're so impressed and grateful.
Yeah, for me, Colin, the most difficult thing was honoring the research without allowing it to get in the way of the story, which is always a challenge for any writer. Jeff was very good and very kind about pointing out to me things that I might have edited out that were historically documented and accurate things, people recall other people saying. That was important to them, again, because they had gone to the lengths of doing this research and trying to make the story as authentic as possible. The other thing for me that I was conscious of was I did not want to edit out their voice. I wanted this to be a collaborative process because, as I've said many times, this was their baby. This was something that they had labored over for many, many years and put together. And so I wanted a product that, yes, it had some of the Bob Dugoni characteristics that I'm known for in my novels, but I also wanted the reader to see that it was launching, you know, two new voices that can write. And you know, Jeff has his is knee deep in another story regarding the Philippines. You know, that I hope he gets published, because it's another important story. So I really wanted their voice to come out in the story. I didn't want to write a book that took out what was important to them.
Well, it almost sounds like you're just being a very conscientious editor in that way, and then adding your own flair to it as well.
Yeah, it was difficult because, as Jeff mentioned, you know, we got an incredibly detailed letter, much longer than the letters that I normally get. And, you know, part of that was because, you know, they wanted to move around certain aspects of the story so that the timeline flowed better. And I completely understood it. But what I was concerned about was, I wanted to make sure that the story was told in the cinematic manner that Jeff and Chris had originally presented it. And, you know, for as an example, you know, the editor wanted to end the story about 20 pages earlier. And I said no. I said no, that's not where the story ends. I wanted the Hollywood ending. I wanted the story where, you know, it's completed. That movie is completed. That cinematic vision is completed. And there was a little bit of a tug and pull on that. And I just kind of said, you know, I've done this for 30 books, and this is what these guys wrote. This was the project. This ending needs to be completed, and it's turned out really, really well. The initial reviews we're getting on Goodreads and some places that are already able to do it really have loved the ending, and that was something we had to fight for a little bit.
Well,
And it
go
helps
ahead.
in fighting for these changes when it's Robert Dugoni, who has 30 books out and been doing this for 20 years, and some blockbusters like the ones
Yeah.
on the shelf behind me. You know, in some respects, it's unfortunate this incredible true story landed in the laps of a couple of rookies. We're like, all right, so he's trying to write a novel, and we'd get feedback like it needs more characterization. Or we're like, right, Chris, what's characterization? Or we get feedback, hey, we could use some more interiority in these characters. And I'm like, got it, Chris, what's interiority? And but finally, the story found its way into the hands of a master craftsman, and he made all the difference. There's a joke among authors. I was talking to one of my colleagues. I said, how's that book project coming? And she said, oh, my book, it's 80% done and only 80% left to go. And I'm like, what? And that realizes that special sauce, that last little bit, is just as important, just as difficult as the first big chunk. And that's where we are so fortunate to have Bob come in and take it from good to great.
Well, I think all novels obviously are a collaborative process, and you guys just demonstrate that completely here in how you're able to work together and work with editors and designers and all the things that go into it. So, Bob, Jeff, Chris, let me just say congratulations. I'm fascinated by this history. I'm fascinated by the whole process of the 11 years of putting this all together. And I think it's a really valuable history. It's a really great story. So well done. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about it.
Thank you for having us, Colin. It was really a wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Colin.
Thank you. Take care. Thank you.